By the mid-1850s, thousands of pioneers were crossing the Oregon Trail each year to establish homesteads in the Willamette Valley.
Those people didn't have time to recreate. It took them a while to establish their homesteads and get settled, but it wasn't long until they were back on the mountain recreating. The first mountain ascent was in 1856. Wasn't too long later, 1889, Cloud Cap on the north side was built and became a resort. In 1890, it was fairly common to ride your bike to Mount Hood to climb the mountain.
While the population and popularity of recreation rose, so too did the demand for organized recreation clubs, activities, and facilities.
The story of the founding of the Mazamas really starts with William Gladstone Steele. He was the founder and inspiration behind the Mazamas. His first attempt at an outdoor club was called the Oregon Alpine Club, and due to some bad planning, it sort of quickly lost its alpine focus. In the spring of 1894, he and several current Oregon Alpine Club members began quietly meeting to form a new organization. July of 1897, about 350 people met at government camp. Many of them having traveled for 3 or 4 or 5 days or more by horseback, wagon, and many on foot. July 19th, 1894, 155 men and 38 women reached the summit of Mount Hood to inaugurate the Mazamas and elect William Steele the first president.
In fact, it was the Mazamas that really started skiing on Mount Hood. There were a lot of people recreating on the forest, fishing up to Clackamas, hiking different places. The gorge was being developed. It really opened the door to recreation when a guy named Wemmy from Portland purchased the Barlow Road and took off the toll so that you no longer had to pay a toll if you drove from Portland to Mount Hood to recreate.
The land around Mount Hood was increasingly being utilized both as a recreational resource and for its natural resources. Nationally, concern was growing about the exploitation of the nation's timber and water. As the frontier closed, people were realizing that the country's resources weren't inexhaustible and were, in fact, being decimated by wasteful logging practices. As a result, the Forest Reserve Act was passed in 1891. This allowed President Benjamin Harrison to set aside forest reserves in an attempt to responsibly regulate the timber harvest in those areas. One of the original 13 forest reserves was Bull Run Forest Reserve, which contained Mount Hood. After the Fulton Amendment in 1907, Oregon National Forest was created, containing what had been the Bull Run Forest Reserve, and in 1924, it would be renamed to Mount Hood National Forest.
It wasn't long after that, in 1915, the ranger stations we know today, and some that are gone, were built. Lots of roads and trails were being built. So in about 1920, they laid out the first plat for the summer homes. And they went on after that to build 600 or so summer homes between Government Camp and Zigzag. And when the Forest Service did that, that signaled to the private people that there's opportunity there. So between Zigzag and Sandy, there's thousands of lots, 50 by 100 lots. You could buy it very cheaply and have a cabin built or build your own cabin. And suddenly there's all these people staying weekends on Mount Hood. And before 1926, the state didn't plow snow. So if you wanted to go skiing, you had to drive from Portland to Rhododendron. And someplace between Rhododendron and Government Camp, the snow would start, and you get out and put on your skis or snowshoes and go skiing or snowshoeing. I like to show, especially young kids, this picture here of a jump at Muldepore, 1934, January. It's wall-to-wall people standing shoulder to shoulder to watch the Norwegians jump. And they've come to Government Camp in a car, parked on the main highway here, walked at least a mile through the snow and brush and swamp to get over there, and then paid 15 cents to watch these Norwegians jump on a Saturday afternoon. The first real, what we would call today a ski area, was Summit in 1927. So these businessmen thought if they posted signs around this area, people would shuffle around inside the ski area, and for the most part it worked. But then that got old after a while. People wanted uphill conveyances, so they built rope tows and T-bars, pommel lifts, eventually chair lifts and other uphill conveyance type things.
More and more people were going up to Mount Hood to recreate and ski, and the demand for organized ski areas, restaurants, hotels, and other amenities surpassed the limited infrastructure already on the mountain. In 1929, the economy crashed into the Great Depression. In response, the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, was created as one of FDR's New Deal programs to hire folks suffering from the Great Depression to construct public works projects.
Between 1936 and 1937, the Works Progress Administration began construction on one of Oregon's most beloved structures, Timberline Lodge. The lodge was to serve as an inspiration as well as an economic engine for the region. In order to construct such a grand lodge, the Forest Service and WPA needed a grand design. They hired the architect Gilbert Stanley Underwood, who was known at the time to be the Park Service Lodge architect. The rapid construction of the lodge took place over a 15-month period at 6,000 feet elevation. The wings were built first, followed by a humongous masonry head house constructed by numerous stone masons placed in the center.
Timberline Lodge was dedicated by President Roosevelt in September of 1937. It was open for a few years until World War II broke out. After the war, there was a huge housing boom as people increasingly sought to move out to the suburbs and start families. Demand for timber to build these houses was rising, and with it was the size of Mount Hood's timber harvest. The national conversation around environmental conservation had changed significantly in the decades after World War II. In 1962, the book Silent Spring was released, and combined with a series of other high-profile environmental disasters, the country grew alarmed at the effects of human actions on the environment. This led to an array of major environmental laws passing through Congress in the 60s and 70s, like the Wilderness Act in '64, the National Environmental Policy Act in 1970, and the Endangered Species Act in 1973. All of these laws had major implications for public lands, including Mount Hood. The rise in the timber harvest and strength of environmental regulations was on a collision course.
So in the years preceding the spotted owl controversy, timber was definitely king on the forest. So at its height, the forest was harvesting nearly 400 million board feet per year. Just to put that into context, today we harvest between 35 to 40 million board feet per year. In addition, most of that early harvesting was done in the form of clear cuts or regeneration harvests. As opposed to today, most of our logging techniques are in the form of thinning. Most of that early harvesting was in old growth forest, as opposed to today, which is more second growth and plantation type of treatments. So the spotted owl was listed as threatened in 1990 due to habitat loss. By that time, about 87% of the old growth habitat that it depends on had been logged and lost in the Pacific Northwest. So being listed as threatened really just means that they are likely to become endangered in the near future.
This gave environmental groups more leverage for reducing the timber harvest on Mount Hood in court, since now the government was required to do something to preserve the owl. A huge battle ensued between the timber industry, including people living around Mount Hood, who relied on timber for their livelihoods, and groups concerned with the destruction the timber harvest was having on habitat. In 1991, a federal judge ruled for an injunction in timber sales and spotted owl habitat on federal lands until a way could be figured out to preserve the ecosystem.
The owl became seen as the poster species for conservationists. And some communities saw the conservation of spotted owl as a threat to their livelihood and existence. So in 1993, President Bill Clinton decided to intervene. He decided to call what's called the Northwest Forest Summit. He invited environmentalists, timber industry representatives, scientists, and many other stakeholders, as well as local, state, and federal government officials. The goal of the summit was to move beyond confrontation and build consensus on a balanced policy to preserve jobs and protect our environment. So what came out of the summit was called the Northwest Forest Plan. Also, some people call it the President's Plan. So in general, the Northwest Forest Plan was a plan that was established in the range of the northern spotted owl. It set aside late successional reserve lands for the spotted owl, as well as designated lands for timber harvest, and it established many standards and guidelines to help manage forests into the future.
The national forests in the Pacific Northwest, including Mount Hood, continue to follow the Northwest Forest Plan to guide their timber harvests. Today, Mount Hood National Forest runs a recreation and restoration focused timber program.